Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's look at the week's news. I'm joined, as usual, by our senior fellows, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, historian and royal broadcaster, and Dr. Philip Kiszely from Leeds University. Welcome, as usual, gentlemen. Obviously, we were going to reminisce a little bit about last week's event for the coronation, but what we wanted to concentrate on this week was the various attacks, or otherwise, depending on how you see it, on free speech. At last week's coronation, of course, they've made a lot of hay out of this as well. The Republican group, well, 6 of them were arrested preemptively, and there's been quite a considerable controversy about whether this should have happened, and the police have indeed apologised to them. Similarly, there is an utterly insidious bill coming down the line in Ireland, a hate speech bill, which puts all other hate speech bills in the shade, it seems to us. And of course, we've also had a new free speech czar appointed. That's Professor Arif Ahmed in Cambridge this week. So it's very, very much in the news at the moment. First of all, well, look, I'll ask you, should the anti-monarchist demonstrators at the coronation, should they have been arrested beforehand, Philip?
It depends what the context is, what we know that they might be capable of. I think that's a key thing, and it depends what their previous is, I think. And the guy who was arrested and who was screaming was very much a public nuisance. Is it a public nuisance in that context? Are they going to spook the horses? Are they going to just be a complete nuisance to everybody else? I would say yes. Now, I really hesitate saying this because I hate any of that draconian shutting down of freedom of expression and freedom of protest. But in this particular instance, I think it was sensible that he and they were removed.
Do you agree with that, Ray?
No, actually, I don't think they should have been arrested, and I think it was quite embarrassing for the police. I'm a free speech champion, and as long as everything is done peacefully and non-disruptively, then I think it should have proceeded. Things like Just Stop Oil, I think there would have been real justification for arresting them, because their intent had been to release rape alarms designed to shock the horses, which could have actually resulted in death. So quite clearly in that situation, if you're forearmed with that knowledge that they have rape alarms,
well, actually that's what I was talking about. It wasn't just the other guy. It was that idea that if it's going to absolutely disrupt, is one thing, whereas protest is a completely different thing.
But did they have intelligence about?
Well, look, I've been debating members of Republic for over 20 years. We're hardly firm friends, but I will defend them on this position because, in fact, I was debating with Graham Smith, the head of Republic, who got arrested, and I must confess to a little bit of schadenfreude when I heard that after months of planning, he ended up being in jail for 16 hours and not able to actually protest at the coronation. So I did enjoy that personally, but I think on a fundamental level, I think it was absolutely wrong, given what we know of the facts of the time. The Republic are an experienced group of protesters. They're not equivalent to Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion. They had been in 4 months of negotiations with the police, and it seems, from what I understand of the event, there was confusion by the police on the ground who didn't know there had been 4 months of consultation, and they had seen Republic with straps which they thought could be being used to tie themselves to lampposts and railings, which would have made them fall foul of the new public order offence bill.
Which is a central part of the new public order offence.
But those straps actually, it seems, were being used to simply hold together the placards that they were going to be holding up. And so it was a question of inexperienced police, I think, jumping the gun. But you can't blame them, but I think the 16 hours in prison is quite a long time for this. So I defend the right to protest, and actually I want them to be seen protesting, because republicanism is the greatest political failure of modern times. And if you want to expose the fact of how peripheral they are, let them protest, because you had hundreds of thousands of people there against a crew of a few hundred of these chaps, and that really, I think, shows how little support they have in the country.
Yeah, but I think if you are going to do these things, if you're going to go to these great big events and you're going to have all of this paraphernalia that can be misconstrued, the police can look at it and think it's something else, then you take the risk of being taken out of the context, don't you? So I think the onus is on them. You know, I don't think in this instance it's really the fault of the police, even though they got it wrong. But it's the general hypocrisy of the whole movement. You know, these are the people, especially Just Stop Oil and the Pride crew and all of those people. They're shouting for everybody to be closed down. The anti-vaxxers, you know, everybody telling that, you know, they're not allowed to protest, they're not allowed to do anything. The minute it comes back to them, you know, they are the biggest free speech champions in the world. It's just the gross hypocrisy that really gets me.
There was also this other thing as well that the police might have taken on board. There's kind of more extreme anti-monarchist group. The Times highlighted, and these were kind of general, what you would call kind of malcontent sort of student types who would basically lock on to any protest group, but they're kind of a little bit more unreasoning. Republic are the best known Republican group, aren't they? They've grown a bit because of this. It's been wonderful for them. I mean, they were on the headline interview on the Today program. You know.
Yeah, I think if for those people who were saying, "Oh, this is great to see them locked up," I think it's backfired because there's no such news as, you know, good news or bad news is publicity, whichever way you look at it. And they've had a huge amount of publicity, and of course they're now being seen as the victims here through all of this, and so I'm sure that it's done a great job for their donations and for their numbers.
I mean, I don't think it's about individual groups, or I don't think it's about particular issues. I think it's about a trend in protest, and that trend is, as I've said before, it's about this idea of performativity and it getting more extreme and more disruptive. It isn't just about making a point, it's about intervening and changing a situation. And if that is violent or potentially violent, the guy who was arrested and taken away, I think his Twitter handle was, you know, man who throws eggs at the king or something like that, you know, is violent, and he had previous for violence. So I think those people and that kind of protest, which is where this stuff is going, and it will get more and more extreme in the next few years, that kind of protest, which isn't protest in my opinion, it's disruption and public nuisance, I think that should be taken out.
Well, and all I was thinking at the time was how wonderful to see the police finally being so gung-ho. Why weren't they so quick to act when we've had years of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. The legislation has been, you know, you don't need to use only this new protest bill. People have lots of legislation at their hands that they can use to stop people causing a nuisance and blocking the highway. And why the police have suddenly found this current conviction now. I'd like to see what happens actually in the future with Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion.
I suppose
well, and of course, sorry to interrupt you, Pete, we're coming into the, you know, the portion of the year that is completely and totally dedicated to Pride, aren't we? So we'll see the police again in high heels and wearing flags and being part of the community. It's difficult for them to move from that persona into an actual law enforcement persona, and that's the problem they've got. They're neither one nor the other at the moment. And when we see them doing the kinds of thing that they've just done, they do it in a cack-handed way because they're not used to doing it, you know. And then they've got to return to being nice and wearing high heels and makeup again.
This is, I think I said this on the last show, that it, you know, I sort of see why they would demonstrate, right, at the Coronation. It would be really kind of spoil sport to do it at a royal wedding, say, or even at a jubilee or something like that. But let's face it, I mean, that is the nub of their issue, isn't it? It's the coronation, the hereditary principle that's happening. So you can see why they should.
Yeah, but they do it at weddings and jubilees as well.
Yeah,
not at the funeral, I think. But,
not at the funeral. But I mean, they always realised there was no mileage really in doing anything against the Queen. But this was sort of I sort of felt, I just thought, oh, why do you have to? I don't want the world, you know, in a way, seeing, you know, what was it, a sea of yellow? We always knew it wasn't going to be a sea of yellow because they've got these yellow T-shirts, you know, and banners and everything. But as you say, it's probably done them a lot of good. Before we move on to what is the actual, you just alluded to it there, Philip. What's the actual nub of this new Public Order Act, which actually I think is literally just on the statute? It's caused a lot of people real anger. There are various new anti-protest measures in it, aren't there?
Well, I think the specifics are things like you're not allowed to lock yourself onto something, which is one thing. You're not allowed to block the road. You're not allowed to stop people going about their business. You're not allowed to be a public nuisance. I think that's the nub of it. And what we just talked about, what we saw in the past, were the police standing by where people were desperate to get to work or desperate to get to hospital, and these people are blocking the highway. So in that sense, I think it's really good. And I suppose in a way it comes back to what I was saying before. I don't think it's about I understand completely what you're saying about Republicans, Rafe, but I don't think it's about individual lobby groups at all. I think it's about this. Are they going to disrupt something in a way that's an intervention, that's going to change what it's supposed to be? And with the Coronation, you can't allow them to do that.
I mean, the Act gives a 6-month maximum penalty for those who are obstructing the highway or stopping people going about their business, also stopping access to airports, railway stations, and so forth. But as I said, you've already got legislation, and the question is why the police needed to have this additional stuff. Now, the police's argument has been recently, which I've been reading up on, is that unlike in Europe, where the police forces in Europe are paramilitary organizations, here we have policing by consent. These are citizens in uniform rather than paramilitary forces. And they say that that's why there's such a distinction between how protesters are handled in Germany or Austria or France compared to how they're held here. Where in Germany they basically get a drill and remove the tarmac from your hand and just cart you off in seconds. Whereas here we're having a cup of tea and a blanket and a fig Newton while they're trying to debond your hand and so forth. And the police in France, for example, can clear a highway in less than half an hour. Here it will take well over an hour, by which point you have a 5-mile backup of things. But the whole argument that we only have policing by consent and we therefore can't be more strict. I'm sorry, but I'm old enough to remember the miners' strike. Right? I remember police on horseback, and I remember the tear gas and batons being used. And to think that those policemen in the 80s would be treating protesters today the way that we see, I don't buy at all. There's a bit of cultural shift in the police force.
Well, it's a police service.
Exactly.
And that's the root of it. It's the police wanted to move them on. They know the tactics and they know how to act within the law. Whether the Human Rights Act, if the Human Rights Act had been in place in the early 80s, I don't know whether maybe that would have had an impact on the miners' strike. I don't know.
One thing that actually, where the police are really hot these days, is on the enforcement of hate crime, right, or hate crime incidents. Despite the ruling and Harry Miller is still going on. With that in mind, I've seen it seems to be slipping under the general kind of media coverage at the moment. There have been some articles about this new Irish bill on hate crime, which basically is like even worse than the one that is in Scotland. This basically, from what I can see, revolves around you actually just possessing on your phone, for example, hateful material.
It's not hate crime, is it? It's thought crime. And I think that's what's incredibly chilling. I think it was one of the most depressing stories I've read for a long time when I read this, because this is about intent, isn't it? It's not about action, it's about the possibility of action. And if you've got a set of images on your phone, or you've got some text on your phone that is in Diane Abbott approved draft form, then you can be done for it by the police.
Yeah, when I was at law school, the key thing we were taught about criminal law was the whole concept of mens rea, right? You had to have the intent to do something. And that does away with the whole thing. This is so insidious. I mean, this is the stuff of dystopian nightmares. You can almost see this being part of a plot to some sort of futuristic, Mad Max film or something, of the future. But it's actually 1984 took a few years to come in, but it's actually 2023, not 1984, because it's not just having a draft letter of Diane Abbott. If someone sends you a WhatsApp message with a
and you're in possession of it,
with a joke, that is deemed hateful. Now, who determines who is the person who says that this is hateful or not? That hasn't been clarified as far as I'm aware. But yes, just by possessing something that you're sent inadvertently, even to a wrong number, let alone by one of your friends, you are then guilty for possessing that piece of information.
Guilty
and of course,
of hate.
Guilty of a hate crime. And let's make no mistake about this. That also includes, for example, say a Jewish historian who has a library with hundreds of books on the Second World War. If he's got a copy of Mein Kampf, that will now technically be illegal. Can you imagine that? A Jewish historian would be arrested for having a copy, or even memes, right? So memes are our version of the Gilray satirical cartoons of the 18th century, right? Where we poke fun at everybody who's in a position of privilege. Now just having memes, sent to you via Twitter or WhatsApp or whatever, those now can be deemed hateful. The stuff that we currently share quite happily and openly on Twitter.
And the focus very much is on gender and religion, isn't it? And I think that's the impetus of the whole thing. So
And race, presumably.
Race, presumably, but I think it's gender and religion are the key things in Ireland, and the idea that gender is front and centre of this for those of us who don't believe in the concept of gender in this particular way is just revolting.
And of course the irony that this should come from Ireland, which has so rapidly cut its ties to the Catholic Church and now actually is quite openly hostile to Catholicism in so many ways, and yet in order to protect a certain religion, let's say this is more about Islam than anything else, it's reintroducing blasphemy laws through this bill. I mean, it's quite a remarkable situation.
And it's the transing of everything.
Yes, it's not. It seems to me that we're talking about the trans race. It will be certain views. I mean, I see, for example, having serious concerns about the levels of migration, for example, will surely become a hateful thing. You say, when you talk about hateful material, does that include things you might say? I mean, in which case, a lot of things we say on this program could be considered hateful.
Well, if you tweet, if you send someone a text message containing your thoughts, that in fact, one Labour Socialist member of the Irish Parliament has admitted the fact that this amounts to the criminalisation of thought. This is scary stuff. And for those who think, oh well, it's just Ireland. Look, we also have something very similar in Scotland, whereby the old concept of your home being your castle is now completely eradicated. I would not be surprised at all if we see the same thing in Ireland coming here under a Labour government. So in the next 5 to 10 years, I'm sorry, but I think we will have thought crimes in this country.
Yeah, and they will be historicised as well. This is the thing. I think we were talking about this a while back.
What you mean retrospectively?
Yes. So there'll be, they'll be looking into there'll be a kind of archaeology, won't it, of looking into what people have said and what people have done and what people have published, and will be held responsible for those things in years to come.
This is a revolution against the majority, isn't it, by the minority? It's a reverse revolution. All of this is happening. It is an attack on the majority by a minority. Well, it's not the other way around.
No, this is what's been happening over the last decade and a half, even 2 decades or so. And I've got a name for it. It's the tyranny of the minority. It's the minority take over the institutions. They take over the universities, which I think we're going to talk about in a minute. They take over the media, and it's this narrative that everybody has to buy into. And much of it is a fantasy narrative, but that fantasy is seen as sophisticated and caring and empathetic, and if you don't buy into all of those kinds of things, then you are literally wicked and evil.
What do you take? I mean, my view about this has always been, okay, we've got trans, we've got the gender argument and the trans argument, but basically, when you're talking about free speech and the problems surrounding free speech, 9 times out of 10, it comes down to the effects of multiculturalism, i.e. that the only way it can ever really work is if you do curtail speech, right? And if you curtail criticism of certain other issues, or what one religion or what one ethnic group might do. It seems to me that there can't be any, coincidence that as immigration has hugely expanded, so is this expanding. It's almost enforcing people to accept the situation and get on with it.
I would say that it's more to do with the shifting culture and the arrival of new ideologies. And I only say that because Canada, for example, was far more multicultural than we were until very recently. So Britain's only become extremely multicultural recently, and in Canada now of course it's the capital of woke, but it took a long time to get there. And I know full well in America and Canada, which are very multicultural populations, they had a lot more free speech around these sorts of things. It's only been in the last 10, 15 years that we've seen this curtailment of the right to criticize or make fun, even innocent fun, of different groups and so forth. So I think multiculturalism, well, this is the Gramscian thing. Minorities are being used by those with power to advance an agenda. Britain didn't have the multicultural population before, so it couldn't use it. Now it's got it and it's using it. But I think certainly there are precedents for multicultural societies existing where actually free speech wasn't an issue.
Because when people say they do all the time, all the time, oh, you just can't say what you want to say anymore, right? Generally speaking, I don't have data for this, but it's my hunch, that on the whole, it's not about trans. That tends to exercise people like us a little bit more. It's usually around migration and racial issues. It's usually around that, because that's where they feel so utterly powerless, and where they always say we can't say anymore what we really think. In other words, they've still got a sense of we. They've got a sense of we. Something has been done to them over which they've had zero control, and they're being told to shut up about it.
Yeah, I think that's what most people feel incredibly upset about. It's the speed. We've talked about this before, though. It's the speed of the change. It's the sheer numbers. You were talking on GB News the other day. You were talking about 600,000.
675. That's what's the estimate for this year.
It's staggering. Okay, so it's the speed, it's the sheer scale, and it's the fact that we live in this tiny little country where we're all crammed in, living cheek by jowl. If anybody lives in cities all around the country, we live in cheek by jowl, and you can feel the tension there.
And if you look at GB News and YouTube channels and so forth, trans issues are discussed every day, right? So there's a lot of discussion of trans issues, and I don't think really there's that much. Yes, academics can be cancelled, but generally people are feeling quite free to say what they want to. But it's race and Islam that are the two no-go areas. That's why you have people like Ricky Gervais, who's held up as being one of the great champions of free speech. Nowhere in his comedy does he ever touch on race or on Islam, despite having a go at the trans community, or the trans lobby, I should say, all the time. Dave Chappelle, the same thing. All of these brave comedians aren't that brave because they don't actually touch on the two most significant issues of all.
Where there would be real consequences.
Because they know full well that is the no-go zone. What's funny is if you compare comedy, say, from the 1970s to today, in the 70s, the taboo was sex. Yeah. So everything was double entendre, but you would come out and you would have overtly racist jokes said by comedians, by mainstream comedians. That's completely changed now. Now, when it comes to sex, you're given the most graphic, appalling details of people's sex lives and their jokes and so forth, but you mustn't touch anything to do with race.
Yeah, as we know with the Pulitzer Prize winner, whose
Pulitzer
Prize winner, whose whole raison d'etre is his addiction to pornography.
Well, I think that it is utterly terrifying. I still can't quite believe that these things are happening in Western European democracies. It's extraordinary to me. But we should certainly keep an eye on that one as it goes through, however long it might take. Before we sign off, can't really leave this week without asking you fellas what you thought of the coronation, because it's the first time we've met since. Obviously, Rafe, you were doing stuff every day on GB News and other places, weren't you? I took to the country to, have a rural celebration, which was lovely. What was your overall impression, Rafe?
I thought it was a triumph. I thought it was a tour de force. I had admit to being one of the critics who had been annoyed and frustrated by the decision to abandon certain traditions. I don't naturally like modifications and modernizations of ceremonies, but actually I thought it went really well. If I can put it this way, as I said just the other day, it was a 21st century medieval ceremony. If that makes sort of sense to you. It kept to its core traditions. It was fundamentally Christian at its heart.
Protestant.
And with the important constitutional provisions of making the oath to uphold the Church of England, the King still being Supreme Governor of the Church of England, but it reflected the realities of modern Britain. Now, I always favoured what Sir Roy Strong had argued for, that the coronation shouldn't change at all, and that after the coronation you could reuse Westminster Hall, where traditionally a banquet had taken place in the old days, and that could have been a place for a more multi-faith, multicultural reference, rather than including it in the coronation service. But anyway, as it was, I thought it worked very well.
Well, as I said last week, on the run-up to the coronation, I just wasn't engaged or particularly interested, I have to say, until the Saturday, and I was completely enthralled by the footage. I thought it was moving. I was moved in a way that I didn't think I would be. I was quite moved by the sight of the King actually being quite frail as well, and that fed into it for me. And I thought Camilla was wonderful. I thought there was a little bit of comedy around Harry and Princess Anne's hat, her feather, which was superb, which added to the occasion for me massively. But generally speaking, the actual footage, I watched it on television, the actual footage of the event was stunning. The commentary on the terrestrial channels, BBC and ITV, was just appalling.
Really, I wasn't really. Actually, there was quite long sections of it where there wasn't much commentary at all, which was quite
good.
Was quite good.
Yeah.
I have to say, I mean, I sort of agree. It seemed to be a particularly British, if one can still say that, genius in what they had done with that service, to cut it in half, basically, but somehow managed to contrive to make it seem like it hadn't been cut at all.
But it's such a rich ceremony that you can actually slice off great portions and it still doesn't lose its power and its majesty. What really struck me, I mean, you mentioned the King looking quite frail there. This was a very different coronation, the way it looked, to 53, just because of technology. Back in 53, cameras were so primitive, they were far back, they couldn't zoom in, and so the coronation looked like a Hollywood epic, you know, one of those sort of in CinemaScope or Panavision, you know, everything was done on the grand, almost theatrical set. Here we were coming in right close into the coronation chair and to the King with an intimacy that we haven't had before, and he did look vulnerable because, of course, he's having a huge weight put on his shoulders, and I think it's important that the King is vulnerable at that moment as he realises the enormity of what he's taking on.
There was a little bit too much. Occasionally, you know, you could see the prompt cards. You know, I could actually read some of the prompt cards. I was thinking, I don't want to see that. You know, I want to be outside of that kind of intimacy, that kind of detail, which takes away from the from the grandeur, spectacle, and and distance of the whole thing.
Prince Philip told a story once about how he actually went ahead and learned what he had to say, but then realised that because they had these cards next to you, so you can just turn and read. He didn't want to appear rude, so he read it anyway. But he'd actually already learnt it.
I liked one of the memes where King Charles looking at him, and the meme said, "I'll have the pie and chips, please."
Yes, exactly. No, there's one with Camilla saying that, where yes, I'll have soup of the day. But I thought that all of it was remarkably when the crown went up and then down. I don't know. There was some real tribal memory, a tribal feeling that was evoked in me, and I found it sort of very, very moving. And I thought, there were just. They were wonderful. I mean, okay, everyone's been going on about Penny Mordaunt and everything, but it was quite a spectacular touch, actually. There was this woman doing this, for the first time a woman doing it, somehow completely rising to the occasion, and even she looked spectacular.
Lady of the Lake.
Yes,
came out with Excalibur.
She did look fabulous, but
doesn't
just because she looked fabulous, she shouldn't become Prime Minister.
That's the funny thing. People say, I want her to be Prime Minister, but that shows you the sort of society. Well, it was ever thus, I suppose. For me, the great moment, one of my favourite pieces of music of all time, I'd love it to be at my funeral, but it's called I Was Glad. I'm not sure that that's quite the right phrasing for my funeral. But when Parry's arrangement of Psalm 122, when the King and Queen first enter the Abbey, and then it used to be the boys of Westminster College, but it's the choir now of Westminster scholars sing the Vivats, And we remember that Vivat Elizabetha, so wonderful, 53. And I was so curious as to how it would sound with Rex Carolus and Camilla Glorias. And I don't mind admitting, I had a couple of tears in my eye at that moment with that majestic scene. And then again with the anointing, when the king is shielded from our gaze, still recognizing the solemnity. People thought maybe this will be televised. No, the deeply sacramental nature of the coronation was preserved intact, with that wonderful Zadok the priest by Handel. And suddenly you also realize how many great pieces of music we've given to world civilization through our coronations, you know, Walton, Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance, you know, Crown Imperial, all the sort of stuff that was done just for our coronation. And there's wonderful new pieces, I have to say. Another great thing about these British state events is the creative arts are really involved, and there were some beautiful pieces done.
This is one of the things that it's one of the things that I found really moving. It's not just about monarchy, it's not just about royalty, it's actually about culture, isn't it? And that sense of what we give to the world is incredibly moving.
Well, it's sort of transcendental, baby. You know, isn't it really? In its real true sense, you know, what you're talking about, that kind of music should be transcendental. Very beautiful. You know, I was going to end just simply saying, you know, there are a few sour notes. You know, that actress on ITV saying about being a terribly white family and all of that, but I won't mention that actually, because it's just, you know, why give her the publicity anyway. Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you very much, Dean Rafe, and we shall see you next time on Newspeak. Okay, take care. Hello, if you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.